So we're talking about Acts 2, and we've already talked a huge portion of Acts 2 because there's so much to relate to Pentecost or Shavuot and what goes on in Pentecost and what goes on in Acts chapter 2. So I just want to maybe give a moment if anyone wants to share some of the things they remember about the connections between Acts 2 and Pentecost or Shavuot, giving of Torah, just to kind of help everyone maybe that isn't familiar with that stuff to get caught up a little bit. And then we'll go on to what some of the things I want to discuss this morning. So does anyone have any, what collective memory do we have about this and the connection of Shavuot and the giving of Torah?
I remember us talking about how Shavuot isn't really complete until everybody's needs are met.
Yep. Awesome. Yep. So at Shavuot, you knew that you had completed the festival. The festival was a success because the needs of all the people were met. And that's really important piece of this story in Acts 2 that we often just overlook, where it says, and they sold all their possessions and made sure everyone's needs were met. Anything else?
I would also say, considering the climate and the setting and what was going on, to set the tone for how we read Acts 2 and why they were gathered together and what they might have been feeling based on what was going on around them in the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very similar feel with Rome's occupation of Israel and the oppression of the Israelites, and or back as coming out of slavery and Exodus, how the feeling and the fear and not sure what was next was all the things. Yep. What about some of the imagery that overlaps?
Well, you had the fire,
Mm-hmm.
so that obviously has some connections with the original Exodus, Sinai, the giving of the Torah.
Yep. Excellent. Any others?
Well, the fact that there were many different languages being heard at the time, an indication that God's redemption is for all people, not just the people of Israel.
Yes, absolutely. Good. I think one of the more poignant overlaps is that in Exodus 32, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the tablets, and the golden calf is there, and 3,000 people are put to death. And in Acts 2, 3,000 people are baptized. So we have the callback of the 3,000 there, and it's an interesting, one is death and one is repentance, which is very interesting. Anything else? All right, good. So there's a lot of overlap between what goes on, the imagery of Acts 2, and what went on during the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. We covered a few of those pieces, but it's really important for us to know that or recognize that the author really wants to cement this in the reader's mind, that what is happening in this moment in Acts 2 is in some way a repeat or a callback or an echo of the giving of Torah on Mount Sinai. And that's important for a lot of reasons, but I want to hear maybe why you think it's important that the author wants us to hear Mount Sinai particularly, and the giving of Torah particularly, as the echo that they want to emulate here. Why is that important?
I feel like part of the importance of it is to kind of reemphasize the continuity of the message, the gospel message and salvation message.
Okay.
And so to not have a break with the rest of the Jewish faith, as they are then preaching the Messiah, So I think just like rhetorically in terms of what the author is doing with it, I think, I think that's part of it, is to kind of firmly root this, but also kind of say this is the beginning of the next maybe expansion of God's kingdom from out of Egypt into Israel, to out of Israel into the world.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to note, and this is a space in which I think this chapter, along with a few other chapters in the New Testament, that we kind of get a little bit of wrongheadedness, right? Like, because it talks about, and on that day, 3,000 were saved, or the number being saved, where there were numbers added every day, those being saved. And we have often been taught or have read that as conversion. And I think that that's a very potentially dangerous reading of that. I don't think the people in that moment thought they were being converted to a new religion. They weren't leaving Judaism and changing religious belief to Christianity. Instead, they were Jews who now have become convinced that they were in the Messianic era and Jesus was that Messiah. That's a different setting than conversion, right? It's kind of what Wade was saying. It's like a new expansion. It's an evolution of the Jewish faith, and honestly, an anticipated evolution of the Jewish faith. And I think that's really significant, right? In fact, Peter's sermon in this chapter actually touches on that David knew that the Messiah would come through him, so he started speaking and started teaching a Messiah, according to, let's see, I'd say verses 30. Since he was a prophet, he knew that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would put one of his descendants on his throne. Foreseeing this, David spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, saying he was not abandoned to Hades, and nor did his flesh experience corruption. And so there's this sense of, it was anticipated. Daniel, much of the book of Daniel was used as a messianic book. Jeremiah, Isaiah have many messianic passages. So all of this was expected evolution in the Jewish faith. One of the dangers that Christianity has done through the years is made itself to be a different religion than Judaism. And that creates some complications of whether people become anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, that sneaks into our sermons, into our language, into the way we think about the text. And all those things can be very harmful. So we just want to be cautious of that and recognize that in this moment, these people baptized were not being baptized assuming that they were leaving Judaism and becoming Christians, but that instead, Christian meaning Christ, meaning anointed, meaning Messiah, instead they were Jews that now believed the Messiah. So that's really important for us to remember, right? Christ just means Messiah. It's not Jesus's last name. Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah. And so these folks who are Jewish now are recognizing the Jewish Messiah. Anything else anybody wants to add to this, like why this is important, an important setting for us?
Well, one thing I was thinking about, Don, is the giving of Torah was really establishing God's covenant with the nation of Israel. All right, so this is basically, to me, another affirmation that God's covenant is still in force, that God has not rescinded his covenant. It's continuing on, and his promises are coming true.
Absolutely. You know, this is another important piece for us to think about because, you know, Christianity has often been, you know, have replacement theology that Christianity replaces Judaism and all this stuff. And we talked about the new covenant replacing the old covenant, or the New Testament replacing the Old Testament. And one of the things that I think is an important note for us is that Israel never imagined when receiving a new covenant that it replaced the prior covenant, right? God makes a covenant with Adam and Eve that Israel doesn't believe was replaced when God makes a covenant with Abraham, which Israel doesn't believe was replaced when God makes a covenant with Moses, or then with David, or then with Jesus. That the covenant doesn't replace the previous one. It instead evolves. It broadens it. It makes it larger. It makes it contain more and have more insight into God and to draw us closer. And so again, when we have this mindset that we have a new covenant and therefore it replaces the old covenant, that's a bit wrong-headed, right? Because Israel never imagined that a covenant that was meant to last forever, that only meant last forever until we came up with a new one. No, it was meant to be forever. And so yeah, I love that picture, Mitch, that that this is another covenantal moment that kind of just anchors this moment again. Yeah. I think another piece to this is that Moses, what did Moses believe was going to come after him? What does he say? What was Moses anticipating in the form of another person?
Well, Don, are you talking about another prophet like Moses, that particular reference?
Yes, absolutely. And I unplugged my my video. Sorry. Hi, June. My dog wants in. Come on up here. You gonna come up? Come on. June does her rounds when she gets up in the morning and walks into every room to make sure that none of us accidentally left food laying out. She wants to make sure it's all taken care of. So I think it's important that, you know, we recognize that Moses believed that there would be a prophet greater than him that would come. And again, this connects us with Moses and Mount Sinai and reminds us of this prophet, right? This picture of a prophet. So, all right. So all of those are so important for us. And there's many more, but I don't want to spend all of our time just kind of pushing into those. And if anyone's interested, just let me know. I have some papers that are really cool at showing all the connections, or at least a huge amount of the connections between Shavuot and what takes place in Acts 2. It's a paper written by Ray Vander Laan that has just a whole bunch of wonderful connections that I highly recommend. But I want to focus today on the part that I believe, Sarah, it was you that mentioned that nobody had need amongst them. So we've been talking about Acts as a field guide to overcoming empire. And why do you imagine, what is the importance of that verse with this mindset that we're reading Acts for, or within, with that lens? Why is it important for us to read this and see that nobody had need?
that it was the early church that provided for itself. It wasn't the empire kind of
Yeah.
stringing on people.
Yeah, I think that's a very important piece. And I think that there's some more to it than that too, right? I think that the church was doing it, the work, but also what Lee? Go ahead, Lee.
Um, Deuteronomy, some chapter I can't remember. If you do all that I command you, there will be no one in need. So whenever you see someone in need, reach out your hand. Something, something.
Yeah, so Deuteronomy 15, right? So this is part of the Deuteronomy 15 picture of nobody in need. But let's just think practically. What is the practical aspect of this? If this is going to be the beginning of overthrowing empire, why is this an important piece of it? Why did Rome start circuses and bread?
To distract from needs that they weren't able to fulfill.
Okay. What else?
I think there's kind of a paradox that um, empire, that revolutions start because the people have unfilled needs, um, and that there's no reason to rise up against empire if empire is fulfilling all of your needs already. And so so I think paradoxically that means that, you know, being able to fulfill those needs in some ways would kind of stifle revolution in that you're removing kind of the motivation. So I see it a little bit paradoxical that the very things that they could appeal to that empire was not providing to cause people to rise up against empire, by meeting those needs yourself, you decrease the urgency of revolution. So
interesting. So for me, the way that I read it, and Wade, I think what you just said kind of pushes against the way that I was reading it, which I think is interesting, is that when you are stuck, like when you are barely scraping by, you rarely have the means to fight against the oppressor. If you're worried about your job, if you're worried about how are you going to pay your bills, if you're going to worry about how you're going to put food on your table, it becomes more difficult to fight the very thing that is providing the very little bit that you still have, right? That for me, like, let me give you an example of what I'm thinking. In some ways, it feels to me that a lot of these protests that are happening across our country that has maintained for a length of time that I don't recall seeing in my lifetime of protests has a lot to do with a lot of these people have already lost everything because of COVID, have lost their jobs. They have all of a sudden they're freed, unfortunately freed, to fight against this oppression because, well, they don't even have a job to go to, so they can go and protest. Now I realize that fits a little bit more into what you were saying, Wade, but in my mind, when if you're barely making it and you don't have enough food on your table, and that means you have to work your field harder or you have to scrounge harder, you don't have time to overthrow. You don't have time to fight empire. Because you're just spending all your time trying to survive. And as needs are met, it frees us up with more time to fight empire. It frees us up with more time to protest. It frees us up with more time to fight against the oppressor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think as well that one way of kind of stating, I think, where you were coming from would be that if the tools and resources that you're using to fight empire come from empire itself, then empire can take them away and therefore stop any revolution.
Yes.
But if the tools and resources that you're using to empire are not dependent upon empire, but are dependent upon the people themselves, then they can't be taken away.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and so I think for many of us in the church, I think one of the areas that that the church has in some way, the church has become dependent on empire to do the work of the church. And therefore, we become less likely to fight against empire. Does that make sense? Ways kind of what you were just saying, right? Like this idea that like, as the church does less and less to care for the needs in its own midst, and therefore government steps in or programs step in that are funded through the government or funded in other ways, that it becomes more complicated. Let's just use that word. Not that it's impossible, but it becomes more complicated to fight government when the government is both entertaining us, feeding us, and oppressing us, right? That's the circus and bread, right? Government is entertaining and feeding us while oppressing us. But it's the opiate, right? As it's said about religion often, is the opiate of the masses. In a lot of ways, the entertainment and the feeding is the opiate to keep the masses from revolting against empire. Wade, did you have something?
Well, I was just thinking kind of in the modern American context. You look and, they released a database of the organizations that took advantage of government loans for the paycheck protection plan. And so you look at the number of church and church-related entities that benefited from that government loan. You look at religious schools that have to make a choice between receiving federal funds and not discriminating. And so I think it's just interesting to see in America, kind of how this relationship between empire and the church, how the church relies on it, relies on the resources of empire,
Absolutely.
or rebels against it, And so in a lot of these cases, so like churches receive, tax exemption so that church and state is not tied in that way. But that also means that the church, in order to get the resources of empire, they say, well, so there's a lot of pushback to churches receiving tax exemption because they say, well, if we don't pay taxes, we don't have to obey the laws of the state in terms of non-discrimination and things like that. So I just think it's interesting, not just in the Roman context, but in the American context, how churches and empire are tied by those resources, and the compromises that churches make with empire to receive those resources.
Absolutely. and then you get into the fractured part of bad theology, that the reason they don't want anything to do with some of the positive things that empire can offer is because of bad theology, and they don't want to be inclusive, they want to be exclusive. And so then it becomes really convoluted and complicated of, like, you know, this wanting religious freedom in the United States. But it's usually, when people say I want religious freedom in the United States, it's usually so that we can exclude people. When was the last time that you heard a church make the news or headlines by saying, we want religious freedom in order that we can be more inclusive to more people and demonstrate more compassion and mercy to more people? Like, we want religious freedom so we can house immigrants. We want religious
That's what
freedom.
I was going to say. That's probably the last time I heard of it would be sanctuary
Yes. And it was
churches.
very little. It was very little in the church, comparatively to the religious freedom that allows you to exclude people. Um, but yeah, the immigration is probably is the most recent. But that would be an example of what the church should be pursuing. But that becomes a threat to empire, right? That becomes a threat, because that's saying that the church wants to function in such a way that is directly in conflict with the decisions that empire has made of who is valuable and who is worthy. And this is really important for the church to think about. And I don't think that the book of Acts could take place and have as much impact if it wasn't for the willingness of the church in this setting to start to confront empire by taking care of everyone themselves. Like, just imagine within dust. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I had an example from my life that relates more like on a personal level of that mindset, because when Glenn and I decided that we were going to move to Ohio to be a support to my sister, whose husband was killed in a military training accident, at one point Glenn's grandma was like, aren't there organizations that can do that?
Yep.
So when you were just sharing, I was just like, I mean, I never forgot that concept that, like, oh, there should just be like organizations that take care of that. And I know that she just didn't want to see us go far away, but just another example of, like, instead of that idea anyway.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like, that's perfect. That's a great example. And I think we've all done similar things, maybe not to that extent, but like, we've done things in our life where we have given up something of ours in order to make sure that someone else is cared for and doesn't need to rely on systems or charities or whatever that are attached to the government. Maybe not for that reason, right? Like, maybe not that we were like, we don't want them to be dependent on the government, but what does that end up doing when, like, just imagine within dust, if we made sure that everyone's needs were met in every way that there was a need, um, how would that transform our ability to then care for the greater community? Would it?
Well, Don, I think yes, it would. Simply one obvious reason is that you have time to do it.
Yes.
Okay, I mean, we're all working, like many of us are working like a 40-hour week or something. That chews into your time. You're raising children, that chews into more of your time. So most of your time is spent earning money to survive or caring for your children or your loved ones. And so there's very little time left over to care for the other, so to speak.
Yeah. Absolutely. But here's the part that I think is interesting. What do we not see in that chapter? Let's see here, in that verse. So it says, verse 44, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. What is missing from those two verses that is prevalent even in dust, but is prevalent in our culture today? What's missing?
Well, I think one thing that's in there is individualism, and the that the unit that they were thinking of was the entire group, rather than the unit being taking accounting of the individuals in that group.
Yep, that's one. What else?
Why do these people have a need? Like asking that question.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's good. That's not what I was saying, but yes, like not qualifying. They weren't qualifying people. It was just as they had need. The only qualification, as I often say about in Matthew, right, that the only qualification for receiving food was that you were hungry, right? Like it wasn't like, well, how much money do you make? And, where else do you get food? Like instead, the only qualification was hunger. So there was no qualifier. What else? Craig says sustainability. What else, folks? Up there's Sarah's tiny hand again. There was no one saying no. Like I ask people all the time at Dust, how can I care for you? Nothing. I'm good. Pray for me. Right? There wasn't people saying no to the help. Hi, Meadow. There people were receiving it. One of the hardest things I think in church today, in our world today, is people not being willing to accept help, not being willing to receive extra that I might have that I pass on, saying, oh, no, you don't need to do that. I don't want. That's what's missing in this passage. In this passage, people seemingly accepted the gifts of fulfilling and taking care of the needs of their household. But I think this goes back to Wade. I think it was you that just said about like the corporateness of it. I think because we're so individual in our mindset that we imagine that I have to do this, and if I don't fulfill all the needs in my own life, then I failed and I don't deserve, or I shouldn't receive anything from someone else. And the truth is that as being a member of the faithful, you are part of a corporate entity that imagines that this world is healthy and good and beautiful by us all taking what we have that is extra and redistributing it in a manner that if others have need, that need is filled with our extra. But we are so trained and so conditioned to think that that's inappropriate for me to receive someone else's extra, that we won't take it. I mean, raise your hand if you're in a live video, if it's easy for you to take other people's extra. I think, and listen, that should be like something you're really proud of, because that's biblical. Those of us who are not able to raise our hand, we're the ones not being biblical. The ones of us that are saying it's really hard for me to take someone else's extra to help me out when I have need. We're the ones that are actually breaking the commands of God, not those who say, yeah, I'm willing to take the extra if someone gives. I think I was going to say you'd be surprised, but I don't think you would be surprised. Some of the sneaky, conniving ways I need to give people gifts through the church so that they accept them. Because people don't want to receive, because in their mind, they start to perceive that they should have been able to do it on their own.
I think there's also the factor that we are there's a lot of like public shaming, I guess I would say, of takers. You know what I mean? Like there's all these assumptions that people on welfare are just being lazy, or they're being sneaky, or they're getting away with something, and people just want to just get stuff without working. You know what I mean? Like we have that narrative. Yeah, and that narrative is very prevalent, and so I think that just is another way in which it's just ingrained in everybody to be like, don't accept help because that means you're doing something wrong, you know.
Yep. Darnell, what'd you have?
A lot of what Tyler just said, I believe we had discussed this before. I remember me and Lee commenting about how it was like certain beliefs, like if you accept help, like you're weak or whatnot, you shouldn't need help, or don't accept help more than once from the same person. But pretty much what Tyler said, yeah, I agree. Those are the reasons.
Yeah, and that's a shame, right? Because those aren't true. You know, even Craig said a lot of people who refuse help already feel that they live in excess. And I think these are all lies that we have been embedded with. And look, I don't want to get like conspiracy theory, but those are lies of empire. Those are lies that the systems tell you in order so we can all remember and make sure we stay in our place. And I'm telling you that those are lies. Amanda said, I think it's hard for me to see what I have that's extra and useful. And if y'all want some Wonder Woman figurines, half-used notebooks, stuffed pandas, all my extra is crap material stuff. But the thing is not all of us have extra at the moment. It's not about that we all have. If we all had extra, then there would be no need. But we don't all have extra. Amanda, right now in your household, you have 2 people looking for employment. That's creating, and maybe the need isn't there yet. Maybe you're okay now, but that potentially, if that goes on longer, that's going to create a need. And that's when then the church, the faithful in the community say, well, I'm going to look around at my extra and I am going to send it. I'm going to make sure Amanda is cared for so that her household isn't just looking for a job and also stressed about how they're going to have enough money to pay their bills, but instead, let's reduce as much stress as we have the ability to reduce. So now all you're doing is looking for a job instead of worrying about how are you going to pay for everything too.
And when the elders at Dust started talking about creating a way for the people of Dust to help share with the people at Dust, and created kind of that extra fund. I think part of that was that recognition, as you said, Don, that our needs, that we have excess and we have needs at different times. And part of how that was conceived is that it, you know, I think ultimately we'd like to do a more formal loan, like small loan program where we would loan out money and it would be repaid, but we don't have that formal structure around it, but I think it's much easier for people to accept something when they know if and when they can contribute back into that, they can. But until then, they don't need to worry about that part.
Yep.
And so I think in a week or two, our treasurer David is going to be able to give us an update on kind of how that's worked out. But I think that is the thing that that there's a temporal aspect to this, that sometimes your need is a need that is immediate, and that your excess is going to come at a different time. And that, just like with any insurance program, this, whether the community is Dust or the community is the First Century Church, different people had needs at different times, and different people had abilities to meet those needs at different times, and trying to kind of match those up.
Yep.
I want to take this opportunity to point out we have a Google spreadsheet that everybody has access to. I sent it in the email this past week. It's a corners of your field thing. So you can fill out there, if you have needs, you can put there that you have certain needs. If you have excess of something, you can put it there and see who needs it. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, in the past, some of the things that got passed along through the corners of the field thing that we've done off and on throughout the last 15 years is someone replaced their washer and dryer, and the washer they replaced was fine. It was just too small, and they moved up to a higher capacity because they increased the size of their family. And so someone else had a need for a wash machine, and it worked out beautifully. And so there's all kinds of beautiful ways for us to pass stuff along to each other. And so that Corners of the Field document, definitely check it out. And seriously, list needs. List the things that you need in your household, and don't think that they're too small or too big. I mean, God's amazing, and God will work out things. So
Don, there's one other thing I feel like I want to mention. In verse 44, as you were pointing out, one of the things that came to my attention, it says that they were together. And I think that togetherness is a huge problem in our modern society. In ancient Israel, in this day and age, you were together literally every single day. The community was small. So you were able to interact with each other on a daily basis. We don't have that luxury. I mean, look at all of us here. We're from different corners of the city, or even, the country, in terms of our togetherness. And so I think that togetherness is also important in recognizing a need. When you're together frequently, you can recognize where a need is and be able to provide for that need. And I think that is something that hampers us.
it does indeed. Yep. Yeah, and this is why I think for us, if we're going to look at the Book of Acts as a field guide to fighting against some of the systemic problems that exist in our world, then one of the first places we need to begin is honest assessment of our needs and our extras, and then genuinely, truly caring for each other. And I think that that's so important, and it's vitally important that those amongst us who have specific needs are willing to share those needs. And those of us who have specific extras are willing to share those extras. Those things are so powerful. And honestly, we will never truly be a community. We will never truly be a reflection of what God desires in this world until we can both give and receive. And that's so important. And also probably one of the most difficult things, because you and I have been raised in a culture that says, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. By the way, I would love evidence that anyone is actually capable of doing that. Like physically put on a pair of boots, grab the straps, and stand up from a laying down position just using the straps of the boots. I would love to see any of you try that. It's just not possible. Or we have the mindset of, you made your bed, now you lie in it, right? All these things, they're just not at all biblical, not at all the way God had called us. Leave the corners of your field for the poor and the sojourner. This goes back to what Sarah said, right? And there you go for all you bingo players, corners of the field reference, right? So, but again, what Sarah said, there wasn't a qualifier to who had access to the corners of the field. It was there. If you had need, come and take. And so for me, I think that if we're going to take Acts seriously, and we are going to be a faith community that pursues this idea and this concept, I don't think we will overcome racism. I don't think we will overcome sexism. I don't think we will overcome any kind of homophobic, queerphobia, Islamophobia, any of the phobias. We won't overcome any of that as a community until we are able to have honest discussions about what our actual needs are and what our actual extras are in this small of a space. It's not until we free each of our friends up, each of our community members up, to actually pursue things other than just survival, that we will actually be able to start fighting against bigger things. Tom says, or not Ephraim says, I think what is hard for me is who I receive from. If my parents decide to buy my family dinner, I don't think anything of it. If my friend who has a very high paying job covers a movie ticket, I don't mind. If someone I perceive as having less than me drop off extra bounty from their garden, I feel guilty. Yeah. And as you can imagine, Tom, my response to that is, you need to get over that, right? Like that's wrongheadedness. And I think you know it, that's why you're saying it, right? Like, it's complicated, but it's because we've bought into this lie of what is extra, right? We bought into this lie. Like, if someone has a garden and they can't consume all the food that the garden comes from, but they are struggling to pay their rent, but they give you food from their garden, guess what? That was their extra. And I love what the rabbis say. And this, I say this to you guys every now and then, usually in jest, and it gets laughed at, is don't steal from me the opportunity to serve you. Right? That's stealing. And so the friend that drops off the extra bounty from the garden, don't steal the opportunity for them to serve you, because that's beautiful. This might be the one area in which they feel they can give back and that they can give some of their extra, and to deny that is to steal that beauty from them. Yeah, I figured you agreed, Tom. He said, I totally agree. Just my thoughts when I think about receiving extra in my life. I was certain you agreed with that. I didn't think I was saying anything that you didn't. Amanda says, I hear that. I turned down Sarah Minardi on some beautiful generosity last year because I didn't know her, except they have a young family. Yeah, I mean, it's easy. And honestly, we also have this weird sense of we owe then, right? Like that we will owe someone. We will be indebted to someone. And the truth is, and this is where I think the Acts 2 picture is really beautiful, is that the community collected and contributed into the central fund that was then distributed. So you didn't ever know exactly where your stuff came from. So you didn't owe another individual. You just had some understanding that when I have extra, I want to put it back into this pot that can be then distributed to others. Now, we don't have quite that same sense, right? It's somewhat what we're trying to do with this fund that we created at the church, but we don't have that same sense because oftentimes it's given directly from one person to another. But I want you to understand that if we truly buy into a communal and corporate aspect of religion, then even if it comes directly from me and I give you something, you don't owe me. The notion would be that now when I have extra, I want to try and give to the community, because guess what? I have received a lot from you guys, right? I want to tell you, Darnell hooks me up with like $5 here and there every now and then to go get some coffee or something. And I receive from the community. People sneak me in some things that are so kind and generous. So when you receive something from me, and you have to understand that it didn't just come from me, it also came from Darnell. And it came from other people that have given me stuff, because as they take care of my needs and take care of me, it frees me up then to take care of other people. And so this isn't one person over another. Amanda said, paying it forward. Yeah, the whole pay it forward. So any thoughts about this? Can you all see how this is important for starting a revolution? Because it would be hard to be willing to start a revolution if you're worried about how you're going to put food on your table. It's hard to be revolutionary when you're concerned whether or not you'll have a roof over your head, or whether or not your kids will have what they need for school. All those things, it's hard to lock arms and run into areas and spaces in our world that need care and resuscitation if we ourselves also need care and resuscitation, right? Think about it. If you are struggling, how easy is it for you to help someone else? It's not. You might still do it, but it's not easy. And so it's best if the needs that you have are taken care of. The rabbis used to say, give as much as you can, but never give so much that you also need help, right? And so that's the whole idea of this extra. And sometimes we're giving more than what we can actually give. And if the community was functioning like this picture in Acts 2, then none of us would be in that situation, right? We would all be able to give out of a place of assuredness that we are taken care of, and now I can give freely to the people around me without concern of my own needs. Amanda says, yes, we have to change our mindset about giving and receiving to be able to feel like a fully functional community, not just one in name. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let me ask you this question, and you can just do it by either applauding or putting yes or whatever. Use the applaud icon, which is in the reactions thing at the bottom of the screen there, or a thumbs up even. How many of you, and I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think about it, have needs? See, this in every sense of the word, we all do. We all have needs. Some of us have emotional needs. The elders and some other people have heard this week, I confronted my parents for the first time in 30 years about the abuse that I went through. And it was explosive. And I have emotional needs because I am empty at this point. Some of us have physical needs that we need help with, whether it be recovering from surgery, or it be You know, Darnell, there for a while, like your foot, I don't know if your ankle's better yet, right? Because I haven't seen you in so long. And so we have physical needs, and some of us have spiritual needs, and some of us have monetary needs. Darnell, what'd you have?
Now, I wanted to say how I think it's awesome, like what we're talking about right now. Like I know with my race, it's kind of almost a big topic, and I think how Tyler talked about how people on welfare, how people say they're lazy, they don't want to do nothing, or they're comfortable. I know some people refusing to accept the help because of what they might receive from receiving the help. And well, I'm not going to get on food stamps. I'm too good for that. My mom was on food stamps. I'm not going to be on food stamps.
Right.
It's just an assistance. It's not meant to last forever.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Is that it becomes almost a mind trick, right? That allows us, that gives us permission to suffer instead of receive someone else's extra. And I want you to hear, God does not desire that you suffer. God has provided extra in a community so that you don't need to. It reminds me of the joke, and I'm sure you've all heard it. There's a big flood and the guy's on his roof and he's like, you know, and a helicopter comes by and says, we're here to rescue you. And the guy's like, oh, no, I'm good. I prayed God's going to rescue me. And then a boat comes by and says, hey, we're here to rescue you. And the guy's like, no, I'm good. God's going to rescue me. And eventually the guy dies in the flood. And God says, and the guy says, I prayed and I asked you to rescue me. And God's like, I sent a helicopter, I sent a boat, right? The same thing's true for us, right? Like you might be the boat, you might be the helicopter, and you might be the person sitting on the roof about to drown because the world has told you that you can't accept something from someone else, or that you're afraid that people will think less of you, or you're afraid that of just a litany of things that are all lies. Mitch says, sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. I have a penchant for taking on the bigger picture. What do I do with a family that has lost their income and have a mortgage payment, utility payments, and need food and clothing? Our financial system creates huge needs that can be overwhelming. How about someone who has to place a loved one in a nursing home and use their life savings? I can be overwhelmed with the need. I agree, Mitch. And a lot of this is not easily answered. But this is where what we can do, we should do, right? What we are able to participate in, we do participate in. You know, did you have something, Darnell?
Yeah, I was going to say, like I like to help people as much as I can, and like I'll even give them like food out of my kitchen or whatnot. But if I'm not able to help, I feel like directing them to like food for thought or something is equal compensation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so there's lots of things, like we're not in a utopia. We're not in a perfect world like Deuteronomy 15 that Lee referenced earlier, that there'll be no one in need amongst you if we follow all the commands, because we're not there yet. The faithful are not there yet. And until we are, there are services and programs that can help people. The thing is that for too long, the church has used those as an excuse to not personally help other people. If someone came to me for food, I have extra food. I shouldn't just go, well, there's food for thought, you should go to them, right? Because we use that as an excuse to not help ourselves, right? And we shouldn't use that as an excuse or to get us off the hook of helping someone in our community. But we also have limited resources. Each one of us have limited resources. And each one of us also, particularly the way that our world works today, and I think this touches a little bit on, Mitch, what you were saying, many of us have very little liquid resources, right? And when I say liquid resources, I mean access to cash or things. Like some of us have a lot of value, but it's tied up in a mortgage or it's tied up in other things that aren't accessible to redistribute in some meaningful way. And that's okay, because that's part of the way that our system has worked and the world that we live in is. But what we do need to do is make certain that we are willing to take and receive when someone is generous and kind to us. And listen, folks, that's been really hard for me over the years. Ask my spouse. She will be quick to tell you that I have turned down things that would have helped our family because I didn't think that I deserved it. And that's a terrible thing, because I didn't think I deserved it. My family suffered because I wasn't willing to accept help. That's not healthy. That's not godly. That's not biblical. So, all right. I feel like we've kind of talked it through. We're at 11:45 almost. So, any thoughts about this before we wrap up and do prayer requests?
One thing, Don, I'll mention this, and I've been associated with churches most of my adult life, and one of the things I've appreciated about Dust is I think that, kind of to back up a little bit, I think that a lot of modern Christian church, especially in America, we bought into the idea of empire and the whole idea about having large buildings, large congregations. And I experienced this at New Harvest, where all your money goes into paying mortgages and all of that stuff, where you have no extra to help anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been modern church in America for many, many years. And I feel like we've never ever had that emphasis in Dust, which I've really appreciated.
Yeah. And was deliberate, right? Like it was a deliberate thing to say, we won't move into a bigger space to grow. If we grow in need, we'll move into a bigger space, right? Like it's been that mindset. And I hope that the mindset of the church then becomes the mindset of each of us, right? That we also function in similar ways. Yeah, Amanda said that was one of the reasons she started looking for a house church years ago. Hi, Meadow. Any other thoughts about this? I would love if somewhere in the future, when people talk about Dust Church, they think of Dust Church as, oh, it was that church that made sure that everyone in their midst, all their needs were met. I would love if that would become our reputation. That there was a community of people that made certain that nobody in their midst went without. That would be an amazing thing. And I think that if we did that, we would impact Toledo on such a bigger and greater level than what we ever could imagine. Hi, Abby. All right. Any other thoughts? If not, I will pray for us and with us and over us. All right. Let's pray. Lord, I love in Matthew 6 where you talk about acts of righteousness and the giving and caring for those in need. And the chapter ends with your acts of righteousness of sunshine and harvest and flowers and beauty, and how you constantly are doing acts of righteousness to care for our needs. Lord, may we be a community that strives to do acts of righteousness for one another, that makes sure that those in our midst are cared for, that they feel the love, they feel the generosity, they feel the drive to be more and more like Deuteronomy 15, like Matthew 6, like Acts chapter 2. Lord, may we be a people that reflect those passages, and we strive more and more daily to do that. Lord, I pray that when we do arrive in those places and in those spaces, Lord, that we take what has been freed up in our stress and freed up in our needs through the generosity of others, and we use that to empower us to fight for justice and fight for mercy and fight for compassion for those who have been marginalized, ostracized, and oppressed. Lord, may we be a people that take care of one another, look out for one another, and support one another in all things. Lord, I love you. I praise you. I give you all the glory. Amen.